Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Levinson, and I am here, as always, with B'nai Lappi for this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. Hey, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how are you?
Good to see you. The weather has turned, and we're back in our t-shirts. Early, I don't remember if
Yes.
you have been, but I have been cold, and now I'm not. So it's very exciting,
Exactly.
and I'm glad to be able to represent Svara. If we continue, for another year, I'm going to need a long sleeve Svara swag. So uh,
Ooh, okay. Now I'm excited to pick out some more swag.
yeah. Um, I'll give you the specs. I have some thoughts. No.
Okay,
So,
good.
all
You know,
right.
I
Well,
started I started Spar for the swag. I
of
just I
course,
just wanted to make the swag.
of course. Well, I'm really excited because we're just sort of settling on a redesigned Judaism Unbound logo, and now we're going to make all kinds of swag. We never did because I didn't feel the logo really worked for swag.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Very
Uh-huh.
exciting.
Fun.
All right. So today we are looking at a text that is not from the Talmud, but it's probably, I mean, most probably, even definitely, composed post the composition of the Talmud. The question is just how long post it, as much as maybe 300 or 400 years. But it connects to, or at least it sort of imagines itself back in the good old days of the early days of the rabbis, right?
Yeah.
And you want to tell us a little bit more about it, what it's called exactly? And
Yeah. So it feels very much like Talmud, but like you said, it's not in the Talmud and it's not uh technically Talmud at all. But it's from a collection of midrashim called Eliyahu Zuta. And there are lots of collections of midrash, and we should probably say what midrash is. So a lot of us are familiar with the term midrash, and we think of things like the story of Abraham breaking his father's idols, and we know that's a midrash, even though maybe when we were kids we thought it was actually in the Torah. But when we discovered it wasn't in the Torah, we got, oh, that's midrash. Okay, the midrash is something like some story that's not actually in the Torah. But
I think a
midrash,
lot of people think those stories are in the Torah. I've
right?
disabused many people of that notion.
Yes, but actually midrash is outside of the Torah. It happened after Torah, and it it should be understood as much more sophisticated than just nicey nice stories, because all the some midrashim are stories. There are two categories of midrash: midrash haggadah, those are stories; midrash halacha, those are legal reworkings of verses in the Torah to yield law. But even the stories aren't just nicey nice fairy tales. Midrash has to be understood as a response to a crash. And anytime you read a midrash, you have to ask yourself, what crash preceded this midrash, this story, or this reworking to make it necessary or important or a fix to some existential angst created by some prior historical event, or crash that made the tradition problematic. Okay, so this is squarely one of those stories, and it's going to be screamingly obvious what the crash is that it's responding to. And nobody knows for sure when exactly this collection was written or came about. It's somewhere between, it seems, the 3rd and the 10th century. Later is probably more likely. But like you say, it pretends to be a story set in the time of the post-destruction, early option 3 Judaism.
And that question about the crash and what it's responding to, I mean, we'll get into that, I think, as we explore this, because it does, I guess, in a way that I wasn't really thinking about so much. The time that it's composed does matter, in the sense that if we knew exactly when it was composed, we might better understand what crash it's responding to. Or, and I
Yeah.
would say, like, depending on who's writing a midrash, it may be, I mean, this is where, just to supplement what you said a little, it may be a response to a crash, and it may be an attempt to stave off a crash. You could imagine that
Mhm.
as well, and that you would call potentially an option 1 move, an attempt to defend against some kind of threat. And and so that's also possible here. I think a lot about the stories in the Bible that talk about that the Jews or Israelites shouldn't worship an Asherah, which was like a goddess figure. And and there's been so many midrash layers upon layer upon layer about an Asherah. What is an Asherah? That it's now translated as like a holy tree or whatever. It's not. I mean, there may have been a tree or a pole that was the symbol of it, but really, we all know now from archaeology and from other sources that Asherah was the name of a feminine goddess in the area, and it wasn't the name, I think, of the feminine goddess. It was the title of a feminine goddess. So the way that we could say that somebody is a god, you could say somebody is an Asherah. And there's actually archaeological findings that talk about Yod He Vav He, God Yahweh, and his Asherah. So there was this idea that God was married, had a female consort. And anyway, the point here is that when you see stories about how we shouldn't worship Asherahs, like that immediately makes me now think, well, that must mean that most people were worshiping Asherahs and the people in power didn't like that. So that's sort of a midrash that says, hey, something's happening here that we don't like, that's threatening our power here. And let's push it away by putting this story into the Bible, into somewhere that says like, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, God actually commanded us not to worship Asherahs. So you folks who are worshiping Asherahs, like you're doing some horrible. By the way, sorry to get off on a tangent, but I think it's interesting to listeners. I hope that the other major story about that from the Bible is the golden calf, because the symbol of kind of, God's chariot basically in the southern kingdom was the cherubim. And some people have heard of them. They're kind of angelic figures. They're not really, they're more like sphinxy kind of mixed animal type figures. And the equivalent symbol of the God's chariot in the northern kingdom of Israel was calves, golden calves. And so when the northern kingdom is read by the southern kingdom as evil, this is what archaeologists and biblical scholars think today. They say, their symbol is the golden calf, and we don't like these people. So we're going to put a story that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the Jews made a golden calf at Sinai. At Sinai, the most horrible thing. And God, Moses destroyed them, and God was very angry. And now these northern people have made it their symbol. What horrible people! The story is in reverse. That actually, the story of the golden calf from the Bible, again, according to biblical scholars, came after that whole situation that the North
and was retrojected back into the Torah to give it
specifically designed to sort of push away a perceived threat. Probably, my guess.
Wow.
I mean, it could be that it was already when the kingdom was still around, but it could also be when this makes a little bit more sense to me as a theory, that when the northern kingdom was destroyed, all these refugees came to the south. With perhaps their idea that, hey, we should build a golden calf. Like, we're getting our people together. We're merging now. Let's add the golden calves into the temple with the cherubs. Then we'll have both of our people's symbols here. And the southern priests are like, no, that's we can't do that. There's that story. What story? I never heard that story. Oh yeah, there's a story about when they made a golden calf. Right, et cetera, et cetera. So
that's so cool. I never knew that.
Yeah. So that's a lot of fun.
Wow.
Okay, so let's look at this story. Anything else before we actually jump into the story?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so let's look at it. And I guess we'll start there. Okay, so this is again called the name of the book is Tana Eliyahu Zuta, right?
Yeah. There are actually two parts to this collection. The collective name for the two parts is Tana Deve Eliyahu. And there's big part and little part. And the word Zuta means little in Aramaic. So this particular midrash that we're going to learn comes from the littler collection inside this larger collection. And the bigger collection, which precedes it in a bound volume like this, is called Eliyahu Rabbah.
Mm. Okay, so the narrator here is talking, and he says, "One time I was walking on the way. A man found me and came to me on his way to heresy." Now, we'll stop here just to note that if you look at the Hebrew, and this is why we actually put it in columns today, so usually we don't, but this word here, mitzvot, is the word that's being translated as heresy. Now, for those who know Hebrew, mitzvot means the opposite of heresy. It means the commandments. He was on. So we'll see in the rest of the story that it doesn't make sense that it would say a man came up to me on his way to doing mitzvot, and here's what happened. So that already doesn't make sense. And the understanding is that this is either an unintentional or an intentional scribal error. And if you look carefully here at the letter tzadi, which is the only difference between the word mitzvot and another word called minut, which means heresy, a tzadi looks like a nun with a yud next to it, in exactly the same way that it would be in minut. It would be mem yud nun vav taf, and in mitzvot it's mem tzadi vav taf, and you can see how you could intentionally or unintentionally see something that says minut and just kind of make a little connection between the yud and the nun, and it'll look more like a tzadi, and then the next person who copies the text will just write it as the thought, maybe the handwriting wasn't so good, and they'll fix it up and make it mitzvot, and then forevermore it's mitzvot. But it also it could be intentional in the sense that people who, there's like a midrash on a midrash in a way, because it could be that somebody was reading this and said, I don't like the idea that somebody was on his way to heresy. I don't want a story like that, so I'd rather correct it.
Yeah, and we don't want those guys out there, probably Christians, to look at our story. We don't want to hang out our dirty laundry, right? A Jew on his way to heresy, that's dirty laundry, as far as the rabbis were concerned. And I think it's a possibility that they didn't want others, this kind of self-censorship in anticipation of either Christian censorship or a violent reaction or some sort of negative reaction, is very common. We see it all over the Talmud. It's been done to Rashi. So I think that's the most likely, but you're right, the letters are very similar.
Yeah, and again, people should know that there's a lot of this in the Bible also, again, intentional or unintentional. There's a lot of notes in a translated Bible, or actually, I guess in the Hebrew Bible, that would say, it's probable that this word was actually miscopied by a translator and actually should have, or by a scribe, and it should be X. Then there's intentional ones like that, like, for example, anytime somebody's name is something Boshet, Boshet was like a bad, insulting nickname for the god Baal. So if you read that somebody's name is Ish Boshet, his name was really Ish Baal, and they didn't. And either they were trying to make an insult by calling him Ish Boshet, or they actually at a later point didn't want to say Baal anymore, so they changed it to Boshet. There's all kinds of reasons, and scholars dispute why, but this is not an uncommon situation.
Yeah, and depending on which printing of this midrash you have, you'll either get minut, heresy, or mitzvot. And I have a critical edition with notes at the bottom that indicate the various manuscripts that have heresy as opposed to mitzvot, which is cool.
Okay, but so for the rest of today, we'll read it as heresy.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes. So one time I was walking on the way, a man found me, and he came to me on his way to heresy. And he had.
Wait, I think we ought to think, what does that mean, or at least raise the question, what does it mean to be on your way to heresy? And I think what heresy means is different depending on what point in history someone is naming you as a heretic. Right? So we have to ask ourselves, we don't have to answer the question quite yet, but let's be aware of the question. What is the narrator representing? Who is this narrator, and which sort of orthodoxy or mainstreamness is he representing? And in his eyes, what does heresy mean? Right? Because this happens all the time. What one sect today or in the past will point to another sect and say, we're legitimate, you're illegitimate. And the one being pointing to is like, what are you talking about? You're the one who's illegitimate. Right?
Right. And I think we'll talk about this, but when the needle flips in the other direction, and the heretic, the one who used to be the majority, is now the heretic. That's a sign of a real shift in power,
That's
and
right.
that's happy news for the former heretics, and it's very upsetting to the previous. What's the opposite of a heretic? The Orthodox, I guess. And those folks are like, wait a second,
Right. Orthodox,
I'm not the
not in the
heretic.
right, not in the sense of today's
Yeah,
Orthodox movement, but yeah, small
right,
O.
right, small o, yeah. So this particular heretic,
Yeah,
it's described as he had mikra, or maybe a better translation is he had in him mikra, and but he did not have in him mishnah,
I
and
love that.
so right, and so right, one could say either he believed in mikra, only the written Torah, and didn't believe in the oral Torah, or I guess another way you could read it is he'd only learned the written Torah and hadn't learned Mishnah, the oral Torah. So he just thought, and his heresy is that he only thought, well, we'll see it in a second, but he only thought the written Torah was legitimate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I had never thought about that he hadn't yet learned. My sense is that he had in him really implies, he was down with. He
Uh-huh.
was down with Torah as the word of God. He wasn't down with this newfangled thing called the Mishnah. And I think that is the story, or I think that's the story of most Jews post-destruction. They were not going along with this new myth that, oh, this newfangled way of doing Judaism. Now you don't have to go to a temple. Now all you have to do is utter these magic words, Baruch atah Adonai. It feels a little bit like Jack and the Beanstalk and the magic beans. Like, who's believing the magic beans? Nobody. Very few people, right? This thing that the rabbis made up, and all these new ways to encounter God, and that used to be done in the temple. I think most people were like, no, I'm not down with that. And we know that historically most Jews went to minut, meaning they left and assimilated into the pagan surrounding culture, because that's what people do.
Mm-hmm.
When you have an enormous crash and it looks like it's over, most people are like, it's over, I'm out of here.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of note now, we can talk about it more later, that if this, just so that folks who know a little bit more about this, like if this book it was written in the closer to the 10th century, then there was another split which was going on in the Jewish community at that time, which was the split of the Karaites with the Rabbinites, or the Jews sort of that became the dominant form of Judaism, of rabbinic Judaism. And the Karaites is the same root as mikra. Kra means the written word, or the read reading. So the idea is you can only read what is written. And so kra is another word we've talked about, I think, on the show. Kra is another word for the Torah. And so the Karaites are the people who believe only in the written Torah, and they don't believe that the oral Torah was given at Sinai and is to be given authority. And there's still a small number of Karaites around. We actually had an interview with somebody, Sean Lisha, from the Karaite community recently on Judaism Unbound, which is fascinating. So there was this, but at that time, the Karaites were a very large movement. Certainly in comparison to the Rabbinites, they were of similar magnitude, I think. And so there was a real concern on the part of the folks writing this midrash, the Rabbinites, that there's this counter movement which is saying that actually we were wrong back then in those early days, and so it's in a way it's the same idea, whether you see this as being written in the 10th century versus being written in the first century, but or the second century, let's say, but the question may be a little bit more: are we responding to a crash, or are we defending ourselves against an attack? But I think the ideas are the same.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And what you're raising for me is the possibility that your framework isn't clear at the time that you're sort of most in the midst of it. You can only maybe, I'm not sure, look back and say, this is how it happened. And maybe at the time of the crash, they weren't able to really articulate option 1, option 2, option 3. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we can imagine this person who's on his way to heresy. We can imagine this person as a Karaite in the 9th or 10th century, and we could imagine this person as a kind of person in, like, let's say, the 3rd century that is still kind of imagining that the right way to do it was the way that we did it before the destruction of the temple, and all this stuff that the rabbis have been doing. It's not. It's made up. It's not right. It's not. It's not the real Judaism.
Right. It's not the word of God.
Mm-hmm.
You made this up. Yeah.
Right. So he comes up to me, to this rabbi, and he says, "Rabbi, Mikra was given to us from Mount Sinai. The Torah, the written Torah, was given to us from Mount Sinai. Mishnah was not given to us from Mount Sinai." And the Oral Torah, right? The Oral Torah was not given at Mount Sinai. And I said to him, "My son, Mikra and Mishnah both came from the mouth of the greatness."
Right. So that's the myth. That's the myth that we develop, at least in my theology. I think that was the genius myth the rabbis developed after the destruction to keep some Jews who would go along with it Jewish, when being Jewish looked radically different from the way it looked last week, previous week. It was. I just think it's genius. Oh, okay. The way you did it before, that wasn't the only authentic Judaism. That was half the authentic Judaism. But there's this other authentic Judaism that I know looks unrecognizable to you. You think we made it up, but we didn't. God also gave that. So I know some people believe that is truth, and that's beautiful and great. I think it was just a divine invention of the rabbis.
Yeah, and when it's interesting. So, well, I guess we can come back and explore this. When he says, Mikra and Mishnah both came from the mouth of the greatness, I think what is trying to be said here is that they both came from Sinai. They were both given from the mouth of God at Sinai.
Yeah.
But what does that mean exactly is open for debate. And actually, I think it comes through in this parable. What did we really mean? I mean, I know that I used to really struggle with this as a child when I was told that the Oral Torah was given at Sinai, and then I would kind of read the Talmud, and there would be all these like debates and disagreements and whatever, and I was like, that was God saying, Rabbi so-and-so said this, but Rabbi so-and-so said that. Like, that doesn't make any sense, and like, so what does it mean when you say that the Oral Torah was given at Sinai? So that's something to think
about. I like that. You were always talking about how we're much more pietistic now than we probably think the rabbis were then. And it could be that they didn't actually mean the way we caricaturize this idea of oral law as verbally spoken from God to Moses and he wrote it down. Maybe they really had a much more modern, quote unquote, notion of Sinai as what we figure out. And we know there are stories in the Talmud. There are a lot of voices in the tradition that say, for example, what any student in the Beit Midrash comes up with was given at Mount Sinai. Meaning, was that actually given? No, I think what they mean is a legitimate expression of Torah.
I think we'll see that in this story. Yeah. So okay, so then the story goes on to say, what is the difference between Mikra and Mishnah? Rather, he told him a parable. So here's the parable. To what is this matter similar? To a king of flesh and blood who had 2 servants, and he loved them with a great love. And he gave to one a kav, which is a certain measure of wheat, and to the other a kav of wheat. And he also gave to each of them a bundle of flax. The wise one took the flax and wove a beautiful cloth, and took the wheat and made it into fine flour, and sifted it and ground it and kneaded it and baked it and set it on the table, and spread the beautiful cloth over it, and left it there until the king should come. And the fool of them did nothing.
I love this. I love this. Okay, so as soon as you see a parable with a king, you know who the king is. God's always the king. Okay, so this is God, and the servants are us. And I don't know. For me, what's going on is God gave us raw materials,
Mm-hmm.
right? Wheat and flax, it's raw materials.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really interesting that the Midrash right away identifies the one who took the raw materials and manipulated them out of recognition as the wise one. Right from the
Mm-hmm.
get-go, you know what the right thing to do is with the raw
Right.
materials. And I love that, like, the multiplicity of verbs of manipulation.
Mm.
It doesn't just say he took the wheat and made bread.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, that's what he did. But the text goes out of its way to say he made fine flour out of it, and then he sifted it, and he grounded it, and he kneaded it, and he baked it. It's like the narrator couldn't make it any clearer that this wise person is taking what God gave him and doing all sorts of things to it.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of things. Each of which also requires other ingredients, right? I mean, when you make bread, you need more than just flour.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you need salt and a little oil and water and who knows what else. So he's taking what God gave him, adding other stuff to it, manipulating in half a dozen different ways, and coming out with something that's nutritious, right? That you can eat. And he does the same thing to the flax. And for me, the fool, okay, the other one, he did nothing. I always imagine in the white space after this line, the fool, if he read the story about him, would go, what do you mean I did nothing? I didn't do nothing. I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I guarded it. I took care of it. I watched it. I made sure nothing happened to it. I mean, God, when God gives you something, you're going to be right. You're going to put it in glass. You're going to lock it up. You're going to make sure that it stays just the way God gave it to you, because when God wants it back, you're going to want to say, here it is. I took really good care of it.
Yeah, I mean, the story could have easily ended up as like, the king comes back and he yells at the wise, like, what did you do? I wanted to make the bread. I was just giving you that to hold on to, or I
Yeah,
wanted to do something else with it.
exactly. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if God had given me wheat and flax, I I think it's pretty chutzpahdik
Yeah, I
for
agree.
the wise one to do what he did.
Yeah, I don't think I would. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking like Joe Biden shows up at my house, gives me some stuff, and I'd be like, okay. And he's like, no, especially if he said like, well, I'm coming back. Well, by the way, like, I don't even, did the king say that he was coming back?
He
He didn't,
didn't
right?
say. No, he didn't say.
So
But I
like
don't
that.
know. Yeah, the president gives you something, like he gives you this document. He gives you the Declaration of Independence, and you get out your Mod Podge and you get out your scissors, right? And
Yeah,
you cut it up, you make a sculpture out of it. I don't know.
yeah, yeah.
I
No,
don't think we'd be doing that.
yeah. Um, so okay, so let's read on.
Okay.
Um, so after some time, the king came into his house and said to them, to his two servants, "My sons, bring me what I gave you." One of them brought out the bread and fine flour on the table with the beautiful cloth spread over it, and the other of them brought out the wheat in a pile and the bundle of flax upon it. Oi, what an embarrassment! Oi, what a shame! Which one is more favored? It is the one who brought out the bread on the table with the beautiful cloth spread over it.
So my favorite part of this section is that actually the original text does say "oi."
Yeah,
So "oi" is very old.
right.
Yeah.
I think that I made some adjustments to the translation, and I think the translation said something like something else, like like how embarrassing, how shameful, whatever. And I was like, no, it says oi.
It says "oi." There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so it's interesting that the king's statement to the two servants is, "Bring me what I gave you." And
Uh-huh.
and when it says which one was more favored, the one who totally manipulated what God gave him out of recognition and used it to create something, by the way, something that not only could be enjoyed, but that would be used up, right? That
Mm-hmm.
bread's going to be eaten. There's going to be no more bread.
Mm, mm,
I never thought about that before until just now.
mm. Yeah.
But
And
but maybe you keep the starter,
uh-huh. Uh-huh.
which reminds me of your insight about Pesach.
Yeah, no, I got that from somewhere else. But yeah, this idea that they would just take the bread was used up, but you would also preserve the a little pinch of it as the yeast starter for the next loaf of bread. So it didn't actually completely go away.
Or was it that you needed to get rid of your starter and then have the faith that you could start a new starter and teach the next generation how to do the starter? I don't know.
That you would do that once a year for
Yeah,
Pesach. Yeah, I mean it's a beautiful
that's
idea.
cool.
Um,
Anyway, so the king loves the one who manipulated the shit out of this stuff.
yep, yep. Uh, and so now we go back to the narrator of the story, the rabbi, and he
Right, so we're
says,
out of the parable.
right out of the parable, and he says, and then I said to him, to the person who was on his way to heresy, my son, if I find within you the mission of the sages, would that put the lie
No,
to your words?
not if I find within you. If I find you within,
Oh, if I find you within the
yeah,
mission of the
the
sages.
mission.
Sorry.
Yeah.
If I find you within the mission of the sages, would that put the lie to your words? He told me yes. In other words, if I find that you're actually living your life based on the Mishnah, then would you agree that actually the Mishnah is the word of God, something like that, right?
Yeah, agreed.
So he told me yes. So I said to him, my son, when you go down before the ark on Shabbat, how many prayers do you say? This basically means how many in the Amida prayer, how many prayers, how many different blessings do you say? And there is a different Amida prayer for Shabbat as for a weekday. And this man says, how many do you say on Shabbat? He says 7. And I said to him, and on other days, how many do you say? And he told me 18. And in fact, that's the difference between the Shabbat and the weekday. I mean, actually, it's 19, but that's a whole nother story.
Which, by the way, the whole story of why it's 18 and not 19 also has to do with people, the mention of people going off into heresy. But we'll leave that aside.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. So then so then I said to him, my son, how many blessings do you make for the morning Shema, Hear O Israel prayer? And he told me 2 before and 1 after. And I said to him, and how many do you say in the evening? And he told me 2 before and 2 after. Again, this is the sort of rabbinic rules.
But this guy clearly thinks that's what it says in the Torah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Like,
of course.
Yeah, I mean that's what we do. That's what we do, right?
Right.
And I said to him, my son, how many people read from the Torah on Shabbat? And he told me 7. And I said to him, and on Mondays and Thursdays in the afternoon prayer on Shabbat, how many? And he told me 3. So again, same story.
Right. How many aliyahs are there? Oh, we all know it's from the Torah. God said so, right?
Right. So there's some more examples that are given. We didn't include them. And then he says, and I said to him, my son, and don't you have these practices from Mount Sinai? And isn't it the case that they are none other than the mission of the sages? So I guess maybe we should look at those questions one at a time, because he says, my son, and don't you have these practices from Mount Sinai? In other words, isn't the story that you're telling yourself that this is like you just said, B'nai, like this is what we do because it's in the Torah, or it's somehow like this is not like a practice. This is not a minhag. This is not just, this is the law. This is the law, and all the laws must come from Sinai. So if you're doing this in this kind of religious way, then of course you must believe that it's from Sinai, right?
Right, and this speaks to the effectiveness of the myth that the rabbis told, and that we tell generally when we tell a myth, that, like when we do a wink, one of the dangers of the wink is that people will really miss it. Mm-hmm. The purpose is for people to miss it, but the danger is that people will miss it. Mm-hmm. And people will think that what they're doing, which was actually geniusly made up, was actually from Sinai, which tells them that only things that they've been convinced are from Sinai
Mm-hmm.
are real and legitimate, and things which they see are in creation are not legitimate. That's the downside of the wink.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what we talk about in the Talmud. It's like the Talmud in the end failed in a way because
Mm-hmm.
people are no longer able to see the wink. They're no longer able to see the process being demonstrated as a deliberate way to purposely read bigger truth out of smaller truth.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I love that it notes that this guy's certain what he does is from Torah, and that's precisely why he's leaving, because he thinks that the new stuff that's being created is somehow qualitatively different from all of these practices that he does. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that like it does make a lot of sense that this is referring to me. It makes a lot of sense that this is really sort of a polemic against the Karaites, because from the perspective of the Rabbinites, they've been doing it this way for a long time now, for hundreds and hundreds of years, and now there's this group of people that are saying, hey, actually, when you think about it, this didn't really come from Sinai, And by the way, it's interesting to think about that as maybe happening after the writing down of the Gemara of the Talmud, because you're like, look, I mean, maybe it's the same thing that I was saying as a child confused me, that I was like, wait a second, I don't think God said, and Rabbi so and so said this, and Rabbi so and so said that, like that. What do you mean the oral Torah was given at Sinai and the Talmud is the oral Torah and now it's written down? It's like, that's not what I don't believe that God said. So it starts to say like, well, maybe you've actually sort of proven too much at this point, and by writing down the oral Torah, you've kind of raised serious questions about this whole myth. And here along come these people, the Karaites. By the way, this is not the Karaites' own story, like their own stories that they were around all the time. But here come these people, and they're saying that this stuff that's bogus, and that what's really true from Sinai is the written Torah, and this other stuff is just made up. And so that kind of makes sense as something that's going on, and that's raising an alarm among the rabbis who are saying, hey, like we better shut this down. I mean, this is because there are ways in which this sort of makes sense. So anyway, so then he comes to him with this, but let's look at your own practice. And by the way, like I had the same questions when we interviewed our Karaite recently on the podcast, where we didn't get into all of them, but I mean, I do have these questions of like, look, I mean, you're not sacrificing animals at holidays, so where are the Karaite practices coming from? And I think
and aren't those
option
3 as well?
Yeah, I think they have. I mean, I think there's all kinds of answers that are good. Like there are answers that are good ones that they have. But I mean, like you can see where the questions arise from. They're like, well, you're not living biblically, really. And and I think they would say, yeah, that's right. Like we do interpret, but we don't claim that there was another Torah given at Sinai. And by the way, like I think it's interesting, and maybe part of what we can talk about here, whether they actually, this parable to me suggests that the rabbis didn't quite believe that either. That in other words, that the notion that we all, I think even to this day, have, that there were 2 different Torahs given at Sinai, a written Torah and an oral Torah, like that's not actually what the rabbis believed. I mean, first of all, it's not what they believed. It's not what they were even saying. What they were saying is something more like, no, there was only one thing that was given at Sinai, and it was these raw materials. And the raw materials are then reshaped and made at different times into different things. So that's what it means that there was an oral Torah and a written Torah. It's not 2 different things. It was just one thing. And that, we talked about that on this show a few weeks ago.
Yeah. And you're bringing to mind Heschel's understanding of what happened at Sinai. And if I'm understanding Heschel right, his idea was that there was a Sinai, there was a Moshe, there was Moses. He had some kind of epiphany. He had some experience of God.
Mm-hmm.
And then he wrote down his best attempt to get, the insights from that experience of how we should live.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Midrash. What we call written Torah, what the rabbis call written Torah, Heschel calls Midrash.
Yes.
That everything after that experience is Midrash.
Yes.
And I think that's beautiful.
I mean, we had our conversation on Judaism Unbound last week or 2 weeks ago, where it was just Lex and me talking. The episode is called "We Are Torah," and it was we got to a very similar place where actually Lex was talking about how we shouldn't actually call midrash. In other words, when somebody writes what we call a modern midrash, like the Red Tent or the Book of V, which is about the story of Esther, or anything that we might say or write, we shouldn't call that midrash. We should call that Torah. And that is, and so it's not only that all Torah is midrash, it's that all midrash is Torah.
Right. We either have to call everything Torah or we have to call nothing Torah.
Right.
Right. Like Heschel would say everything's midrash.
Right.
But it is more powerful to say everything is Torah. To call that midrash, which is now, lives in a book or a scroll, to call that Torah, fine. If you want to call that Torah, you have to call everything else Torah because it's not nothing after that is qualitatively different.
Right. I mean, that's again, I don't remember if we said this explicitly on that episode. I think we called it Svara all the way down, but the idea that the only difference between, let's say the written Torah and the Talmud and the Red Tent is when did it get written down? So and now then the question arises, does something that got written down earlier deserve a higher level of deference? And the answer may be, I don't know, you shaking your head. I mean, it may be because since it's been around longer in a defined form, more people have connected with it and taken it seriously, and it's become more ingrained in our culture in some way. So you could say, like, yeah, there is a little bit of extra oomph to it, but that's different from saying we should worship it to the detriment of the other. I mean, I'm not saying that, but you could make some kind of an argument.
For sure, absolutely.
I'm a little worried that we're on the way to heresy here, but no.
I think we've already gotten there.
Yeah. Well, let's finish the text, and then we can talk more. So he says, so my son, don't you have these practices from Mount Sinai? And isn't your own belief that these things that you do are the law? And basically says yes. And isn't it the case, though, that these are none other than the Mishnah of the sages? In other words, that it's in the Mishnah where these laws are written. It's that you might have thought it was the Torah, but actually you're wrong. By the way, that connects to that idea that I wasn't thinking this at the time, but if you read the beginning to say, that he had in him Kra, but he had in him Mikra, but he didn't have in him Mishnah, it does accord with that idea that it means he hadn't learned Mishnah, like he only knew, or he'd only heard of he obviously didn't know the Torah very well either, because he thought that these rules were in the written Torah, but he certainly hadn't learned the Mishnah.
Because if he had, he'd realize that his practices
were in one but not the other.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I get that.
I mean, not a big deal.
That's interesting.
So isn't it the case that these practices that we just went through are in the Mishnah of the sages? And again, the answer is yes. So rather, when the Holy Blessed One gave the Torah to Israel, he gave nothing other than the wheat from which to make fine flour, and the flax from which to weave clothing, all through the interpretive process. That's in square brackets because there's a particular set of words used to symbolize the interpretive process, called klal uprat, meaning reasoning from the general to the specific to the general, but it's basically
right. Even though it's complicated to put this into the translation, I think we should talk about it for a minute, because the Midrash actually names with a shorthand term one of those interpretive tools, one of those kind of exegetical mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone who read it would certainly have understood that to signify the whole set of tools you can use to go from Torah to something that the Torah doesn't say at all. And those are the tools. Rabbi Yishmael had 13 of them. Rabbi Akiva had an infinite number of them. And those are the tools which the Talmud is recording examples of being played out on specific cases, one after the other. So I think the end of this story is also suggesting that God gave us those tools that we're supposed to use
to take the raw material that God gave us. And that's a gigantic statement all by itself. The idea that God only gave you raw materials says so much. What it says is God always wanted you to mess with this. God always wanted, the story of the wise servant who turns the flour into bread, you could equally imagine him turning it into pita. Probably was pita, right? Or challah, or donuts, or pancakes. I don't think any of those would have been the wrong answer, which means that inherent in the story is the suggestion that anything that is healthy and nutritious and useful that you make out of it is okay. It doesn't matter whether it turns out to be this, or that. I think it's just such a powerful story. And I think it should shape how we view Torah. I think it gives a lot of permission to innovators at a time like now, when I think we've got to roll up our sleeves and really start messing with this thing.
Right. And what's interesting about it, I mean, one piece that I think is interesting about it is it's not really saying exactly. I mean, I think it's trying to say, and this may be even like an error on the part of the person who wrote this midrash, but he ends up not saying, I like put this out there for my, Karaite friends, like he's not really saying the Karaites are wrong and the Rabbinites are right. What he's really saying is they're actually not different. They're actually, in other words, like Karaites, you actually are misunderstanding what we believe. And probably most Rabbinites are misunderstanding what we believe. And so this is kind of a, what's the word? Where it's a red herring, that you're setting this up as, we believe in two Torahs and you only believe in one Torah. No. Just in the way that you guys, you don't just do literally what the Torah says. You call that interpretation because obviously there's certain things that we can't do quite the way it says, or it doesn't say exactly what to do. And you say it's interpretation. It doesn't have the same weight of authority, et cetera, right? And we say also it's interpretation. We, I guess, give it a little more weight of authority in that we're saying that once a certain rabbinical council or whatever declares that this is the right way, then it has a certain weight. So maybe that's a difference between Rabbinites and Karaites. But really, what we're saying the same thing, or at least we think we are, Rabbinites, that something was given at Sinai, and it was just one thing. And everything that we've been doing ever since then is a process of interpretation. So I'm not saying that a Karaite would sign on to that, but I think that there's something here where it starts to say, like, well, actually, it's not quite as different as we thought it was. And to me, like looking at this, it's like I imagine, okay, so what is the takeaway from here? There's at least like three possibilities in my mind. One, the written Torah was given at Sinai, plus some interpretive rules. So, that's the raw material, plus some, here's how you can interpret it, like Rabbi Ishmael's 13 principles. Another possibility is there was, I guess, a written Torah was given, plus some raw materials orally, plus these rules. So in other words, that there was an addition, but it wasn't like 2,000 pages of Talmud. It was, a couple of extra ideas, plus some interpretive principles. The third possibility is that there was no written Torah given at all, that there was only one thing given, which was, some version of a few ideas and some rules, something like that, right? And I mean, I put my cards on the table. I mean, I already have, that, I mean, again, within the context that I don't believe anything literally happened, but to the sense that, like, what are we kind of imagining here? It's really just the third case, that there actually was no written Torah given at all, in the sense that Moses came down carrying a scroll. I mean, even just on the archaeological sense, there was no writing, there was no widespread reading and writing at that time in Israel. So, like, who was reading this scroll? Like in other words, it doesn't quite accord with the whole history as we know it, that there would have even ever been a written. I mean, it's just not possible, right? So whatever. It's pretty.
You know what's coming up for me? That myths inevitably trip you up if they're successful. So this story is a snapshot of a moment in history, and I'm just going to say for a moment that it happened at the time at which it was set, right? So post-destruction. It speaks to the fact that the myth of God handed us a Torah at Mount Sinai at all became problematic when we needed, to seriously upgrade that myth, in that material. Do you see what I'm getting at? That the narrator is only in a bind here to convince this Jew who's about to leave that that his practices are actually from Mount Sinai, because we've already very effectively convinced people that there was a Torah from Mount Sinai that for sure was the word of God. And now that myth is getting in our way. I don't know. This is coming to me in a new way.
No, that's very, I mean, because it's like, I mean, to my mind, the story that a written Torah was given at Mount Sinai, based on what we know now about the history of when that could possibly have been, if it happened at all, right? Which is, I think, somewhere, if I have it right, between 1200 and 1500 BCE. So there's like a 300-year period, but because if it's anywhere after that, we already know some of the characters, right? And if it's anywhere before that, it wouldn't make sense with the timeline. So that's the general principle of when we're talking about. And what we know about that time period is that there was no writing in Israel during that period of time, or and certainly not on parchment. So like, where was this written on? If it was written on clay tablets, it would be a lot of clay tablets. Moses wouldn't have been able to carry them, right? So I mean, like the whole thing kind of breaks down from a historical standpoint. Now they didn't know history that well back then, or they didn't have those records. So somebody writing in the 8th century didn't know that there was no writing in the 12th or 13th century. So it would be like as if we
BCE.
Yeah. So it would be like as if we today were writing a story about the founding fathers of America and said like they checked their iPad, or they made the adjustments on an iPad or something like that. Now, at the point at which somebody finds that story and knows that they didn't have iPads back in the 1700s, then they immediately know this story is wrong. It could not have happened because they didn't have iPads then. So that's what we now know about the story. But and like, if I'm understanding what you're saying, like it's like, but if you built a whole society based on this idea that the Constitution was written on an iPad, and it was accepted for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then and it was still accepted. Like they never discovered that there was an iPad. But what happened down the road was they came to understand that there was some new development, right, that had to get kind of that made that whole story sort of not work. Then there was like some I don't know. I mean, it's breaking down for me because I'm trying to think about like what that would be in the case of an iPad.
Yeah.
But they're saying there was the electronic Torah, and then there was the quantum Torah.
Right.
Now we know that messages can be sent through quantum stuff, and of course God would have been able to do that because God could do anything. So why would Moses have been limited to an iPad, or why would the founding fathers have been limited to an iPad constitution? They would also have the quantum constitution, whatever it was. And you're like, you have to do all these mechanics because you're tripped up by the whole idea that everybody accepted that it was an iPad, when in fact it wasn't actually an iPad.
Exactly.
Like, and that's so we get stuck there, and and you can also say like, look, why am I so stuck on the idea that it had to have been an iPad? Like, actually, that's now a distractor. The iPad isn't the point. The point is that they wrote a constitution, right? And so the point isn't that the Torah was written. The point is that they had there was a practice, or there was a set of beliefs.
That's right. And that's why maybe the new myth we need is to go way back to the Torah myth, I would say, and undo that story of Torah and say Torah was a product of our svara from the get-go.
Right.
And not we can add svara to the Torah and the oral Torah and now svara. No, let's turn it around to say what actually did happen, which is, like you and I are enjoying saying it's svara all the way down.
Right.
The svara has always stood on svara. It was a product of that. Yeah.
Right. And maybe it's easier to do that in stages where you say, like, look, before we get to svara, let's just talk about the oral Torah, because all our evidence suggests, right, that there was no written Torah as we understand it until the return from the Babylonian exile, meaning the Second Temple period. So, and actually, like Bible scholars, you sent me an article by Christine Hayes, who's a Bible scholar and a rabbinic scholar, and she and other people have said this about the biblical period. Like, one of the most important factors to understand about the biblical period is that there was no Bible during the biblical period. That's great. That's great. The biblical period, that there was no Bible. The Bible is the book that was written in the post-biblical period about the biblical period, right? So we know that there was no written Torah during that time, the First Temple period, the period of the monarchy and whatever. So once we know that from a historical standpoint, and this is what you talk about option one, right? Option one move is to say, we're not going to believe that. Right, so we're going to push that knowledge away. We're going to say, no, there was a written Torah. Archaeologists are wrong, and that, not a lot of people couldn't read, but some people could, and there was a written Torah. And right, the other option is to say, okay, let me accept that so there was no written Torah. Now let me see if I can. I've been thinking about that lately as like steering into the skid, which like I don't quite know what that means, but I know that it means don't fight it, right?
Yeah.
And like what would that look like if we said actually there was no written Torah during the First Temple period? What that means is that, well, what was there? Nothing? No, nobody says there was nothing. It's like nihilism. Everybody did what they wanted. I mean, it does say that in the Book of Judges that everybody did what was right in his own eyes. But that was a very limited period. But there were bases for societal organization. They just weren't written. So if they weren't written, what were they? They were oral. So now we can start to say, okay, so what we do know is that there was an oral Torah from the beginning. What that means exactly, right? But there was oral, it was only oral. There was either oral Torah or there was nothing. And the answer, there might have been nothing, but there was certainly oral, right? And then, so that's stage one. If we can all wrap our minds around that and say that actually, if anything was given at Sinai, it was only an oral Torah. Okay, then now we can go to the next stage, which is to say, okay, now let's think about, now what do you mean by an oral Torah? Like, do you think that there was a fixed set of practices and rules and ideas that everybody agreed about? It's just that they were oral? No, that's not what we really believe, right? What we really believe is that there were people sometimes in power, sometimes not in power. There were good people, bad people. There was a lot of, just like we have today, there was like, and people were kind of doing their best or not their best to try to, figure out how to run a society. You want to call that svara, that comes from people's like best efforts to live a good life. Like that's probably what there was, right?
I love that. I've given the crash talk to different groups 5 times in the last week. So wow. It's really it's given me a chance to work on it a lot. And I've been like conceptually dancing around this realization, like it's come and left my mind, but you just brought it into focus, which is, it isn't, tell me if I got this right. It isn't so much that the early rabbis had to convince people that there's this new myth of an oral Torah. That's precisely when they had to start convincing people that the myth was that there was a written Torah. That the new story was that stuff we used to do. That's where the I don't know. The rabbinic story is not so much, oh, now we have an oral Torah. The rabbinic story was that stuff was written. I don't know. I'm still not quite there. But it has to do with what you're saying.
I have to think that part through a little more, but like I think that what it is, like what some of the move is understanding is that, first of all, there must have been a time once we understand all this, right? What it means is that there was a time, probably in the early Second Temple period, where somebody, maybe Ezra, had to convince the people that there was a written Torah.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. That's it.
Yeah, and then he was so successful. This is, I think, what you're saying too. He was so successful that 500 years later, or more than 500 years later, somebody else had to come along and say, whoa, wait a second, this is a problem, because if we believe that only the written Torah, and so much of the written Torah is all about sacrifices and this and that, and that's all God wants, and now we can't do that anymore, we're screwed. So we better find a way to say that there was, but we don't want to say that there wasn't a written Torah, because first of all, nobody's going to believe us, because everybody is sure there was a written Torah. And second of all, like we like, then what's our basis? So we're going to have to come up with it, right? So then they say, right. So, but the genius of it, I think, is that the story that they come up with to supplement the written Torah hypothesis or myth is actually more true. It's actually it's not like you hear it a little bit as like a wink, like, right, oh, there's also this oral Torah. Mm-hmm. But in a way, the wink is on the also, because the truth is that it was only an oral Torah.
Right.
And that, and then as you kind of now we find ourselves needing to supplement that myth, because people don't quite believe that there was a true event at Sinai with an oral Torah. So now we're saying a wink, there was also a Torah of Svara.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
But the real truth is that, like, it was all Svara, and it didn't necessarily happen at Sinai, although I'm fine with saying that Moses was a guy who once went up on Mount Sinai and had a revelation, right? That's okay. I mean,
yeah, that fixes it for me. It's that the new myth isn't an undermining of the old myth or the old myths. It's an addition. You let people hang on to the myths that they think are for sure non-negotiable, and you add another piece that allows them to have that, but now they have this as well as a new sacred piece, as opposed to what I was saying earlier today, inserting Svara back at the beginning and making the new myth that it was Svara all the way down. That's the truth, but you're right, that doesn't work as myth.
Well, and I think the challenge for us now, but also the opportunity, is like anybody watching this show now knows, like, for example, like I'll speak for you, like they know what I really believe, So when I say, oh, there was actually the Torah of Svara, whatever, like they know, Dan, you don't really believe that anything happened at Sinai exactly. And I'm like, so I would say yes, and I do believe in the story. Like, I do believe in the power of the story. So somehow we're going to have to find a way to continue storytelling and myth making, while at the same time understanding ourselves and allowing others to understand that it is a myth. But a myth doesn't, just because that the story is not factually true doesn't mean that there's not value to telling the story. And I think we have to work that out a little bit more, because I think that our tendency is to believe that that once the story is false, then it's a power move. It's all about power and the opiate of the masses and whatever, to sort of keep telling that story. And I don't think that's quite true. I know that smart, educated people, they still would rather hear it in the form of a story. And that's not because they want to hear a lie or a second naivete even. It's because there's just something powerful. And there's a way to tell a story and a myth without where everybody hearing it knows it's not sort of factual in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
we'll put a sticky there.
Yeah. Yep. So we'll keep doing that, and we'll be back next week.
Amazing.
See you then.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye, Vinay.